What if I told you that over 25% of Americans are now renting their clothes, cars, and furniture instead of buying them? And this isn't just changing commerce, it is literally rewiring how our brains think about ownership and security. I know that you're probably thinking, like, okay, of course people rent their cars. That's been around forever. But I'm not talking about vacation rentals or the occasional zip car. I'm talking about people who rent their everyday wardrobe, lease furniture, pay monthly subscriptions for everything from watches to handbags to kitchen appliances. And I've seen a lot of different deep dives going around about this rent first lifestyle. And while it seems like another millennial or Gen Z trend, the explosion of subscriptions, it's actually revealing something really profound about how we're psychologically adapting to economic uncertainty. And what really got my attention about this is that this isn't happening because people suddenly love convenience of never owning anything. It's happening because traditional paths to ownership feel increasingly impossible. When you can't afford to buy a house, when car prices have gone through the roof, when even basic furniture costs more than your monthly rent, your brain starts looking for alternatives. And companies have noticed. Boy, have they noticed. And they have created a market for it. While rental companies promise the potential of ownership without the complete financial commitment, it might be creating a psychological dependence on stuff. And it's wrapped up in this explosion of consumerism and feeling like you need to have it all. And I think we're seeing a growing dependence on systems that profit specifically from you never owning anything. This is about how our relationship with ownership is fundamentally changing and what that means for building actual wealth. Because here's the truth. Real financial security has always come from owning appreciating assets, not renting depreciating ones. But when ownership feels out of reach, we start telling ourselves different stories about what security actually looks like. So today I want to talk about the rental economy phenomena. I want to talk about the economic forces that created it, the psychology driving it, and most importantly, who is actually benefiting when an entire generation decides that owning stuff is too expensive for them. Because it isn't about the stuff, it is about how we think about our financial future. So I want to start with the obvious question, which is why is this happening right now? Why are people suddenly more comfortable with renting everything? And the short answer is because the economy has made traditional ownership increasingly unaffordable. But the long answer is a little bit more complicated, but a lot more interesting. So I want to actually start with housing because housing costs have really been the foundation of everything else. The average American now spends 37% of their income in housing. And in major cities, it can be up to 50%. If you compare that to the 1970s, when the recommendation was to spend no more than 25% of your income in housing, and that was actually achievable for most people. When housing eats up that much of your budget, everything else becomes this mathematical problem, right? You can't save for furniture or even let alone a house when half your paycheck goes to rent. You can't buy a reliable car when you're already stretched thin by keeping a roof over your head. When basic ownership feels impossible, our brains don't just accept that we'll have less stuff. Instead, they start reframing what ownership means. We start telling ourselves stories about how ownership is a burden, how renting is freedom, and having less stuff is actually more enlightened. And to be fair, some of this is true, especially when it comes to housing. But it can also be a psychological defense mechanism when you think about the ability to rent everything. I think it's a lot of times easier to convince yourself that you don't want something than to feel constantly deprived from it. So here's a stat that will really make your day. When adjusted for inflation, wages have been basically flat for the past 20 years. Meanwhile, I think many of us are aware of inflation and how the cost of everything from cars to furniture to electronics has either stayed the same or gone up. And that means in practical terms that your dollar does not buy what it used to. A decent used car that cost $8,000 in 2005 now costs $15,000, $20,000. A basic bedroom set that was $500 is now $1,200. And I also want to point out the quality of a lot of these items have gone down pretty significantly. Let's talk about houses, right? Like the median home price has doubled in the last decade alone. So when companies start offering these rental options, they're not creating demand. They're responding to the demand. They saw a generation of people who wanted the lifestyle their parents had, but couldn't afford to buy their way into it. I want to also touch on student loan debt, which is the $1.8 trillion elephant in the room. The average college graduate now leaves school about $30,000 in debt. That is an entire car payment worth of debt before you even start your career. And what's particularly insidious about student debt is how it warps your money psychology. When you're making payments on money that you kind of mentally spent years ago on education that may or may not lead to financial security, especially in today's market, the idea of taking on more debt to buy stuff can feel overwhelming. If you think about a mortgage or a car loan or these larger kind of pieces of debt. So something like renting looks like a more responsible choice, right? Like no big upfront costs, no long-term commitments, no risk of being underwater, if you're not able to pay. Your brain starts to associate ownership with financial risk rather than financial security. But None of this would have created the rental economy without the demand driven by social media and mass consumerism, and also technology that's made a lot of this frictionless. So many of the kind of buying apps that we see today allow you to browse, select, and have items delivered to your door within days. They also have created digital payment systems like buy now, pay later that have made these monthly charges smaller and feel less visible. There's also algorithms that suggest what you might want to rent next based on your previous choices. And the technology didn't create the economic pressure, but it sure made it easy to respond to the pressure by renting instead of buying. So this had been going on for a little bit. And then came COVID, which was the great accelerator to so much of the demand that we see today. Suddenly, we have millions of people. They were stuck at home. They wanted to shop. And I think for a lot of these very big purchases, to them, it felt more reasonable to rent them, right? That expensive exercise equipment, that new car, etc. I think the pandemic was this moment that created a lot of built up demand. And I think that drove a lot of the subscription based rental economy that we see today. But what's so interesting from a psychology perspective is that the same economic forces that made renting attractive also made people financially anxious about the future. Because when you're renting something, that is a fixed monthly payment. So I think for a lot of people that started heavily using buy now, pay later, started using these rental services, these monthly charges add up and they're coming from different companies. So it's hard to kind of follow along, how much money you're really paying. And again, that can drive financial anxiety. And it's a vicious cycle because anxiety doesn't always lead to the most rational financial decisions in the future. Which brings me to the psychology of why our brains are so willing to embrace this rental lifestyle, even though the math does not often work in our favor. Okay, so we understand the economic forces that created this rental economy, but why are our brains so willing to go along with it? And what is happening psychologically when we choose access over ownership? So I want to start with what psychologists have learned about ownership and our mental well being. Owning things, especially meaningful things that are meaningful to us, serve very important psychological functions. First, there's something called endowment effect. Once we own something, we value it more highly than we did before we owned it. It's not just about the item itself, it's about the relationship we form with it. When you own your couch, it becomes your couch. It holds memories, it represents stability, it's part of your identity and your space. Second, ownership gives us a sense of control and security. When you own your car, you know it will be there when you need it. You know its history, its quirks, its reliability. There's no monthly payment that could make it disappear, no company that could decide to take it back, no terms of service that could change, right? Third, ownership is how many of us build wealth over time. When you buy a house, you're not just buying shelter. You are getting an asset that historically appreciates in value, or at the very least allows you to build equity in your home. When you pay off a car, you have something of value that you could sell, trade, or pass down. Granted, cars are depreciating assets, but you can still sell the car afterwards. Finally, ownership is deeply connected to our sense of identity. The things we choose to own and keep often reflect who we are, what we value, what we want our lives to look like, how we want other people to view us. And there's a reason why people get emotionally attached to old furniture or clothing. These items become part of our personal narrative. So what happens when we shift from an ownership to an access-based model? What does that do to our psychology, to our brains? In some ways, it actually is liberating, right? Like there is real cognitive relief in not having to research, choose, maintain, store, and eventually dispose or sell of all the stuff in your life, right? When you rent your furniture, somebody else worries about it once you're done with it. When you rent your clothes, you don't have to worry about like saving up for something expensive because you only wear it a few times, right? And this is actually a reduction in decision fatigue. And it is one of the real benefits of the rental economy. You don't feel like you have to really commit to something. And, every choice you don't make is mental energy you could spend elsewhere. And there's also the flexibility factor, which I think is very powerful when you think about renting a home versus buying a home. I think for a lot of people, it makes sense to rent over buying. I think when you're not tied down by stuff, you can easily adapt to changes in your life. Got a job in a new city? No problem. You could just return your rented furniture and rent new stuff when you get there. If you want to try a new style, you can swap out your rental wardrobe for something completely different. And I think especially for younger people who have been told that flexibility and adaptability are the key to career success, there's psychological freedom that can feel incredibly valuable. But I also want to talk about a lot of the flexibility that comes with renting is also due to our consumer culture and just how fast trends are changing. Like if you think about something like clothes, trends are changing much, much faster than they used to due to the internet, due to social media. And I think renting gives people the ability to continuously adapt to new trends and additionally adapt to consuming over and over again, which is not a good thing for our society, but also for kind of our money as well. And I want to kind of transition into some of the less obvious psychological downsides to the rental lifestyle that I don't think enough people talk about. I think the first thing and the most important thing is that your brain fundamentally rethinks its relationship to objects. When everything feels transient in your life, when you feel like you don't fully own everything, you treat your objects differently. And that can bleed into other areas of your life. If you kind of view everything as transient and can be easily discarded, that shapes how you think about your community, your relationships, etc. And I know that sounds kind of dramatic, but that is really kind of psychologically how our brains work. There's also a psychological impact in never building equity in anything. When your monthly payment is purely an expense rather than a way to build equity, a potential investment, that can create kind of psychological dangers. You're always paying, but you're never actually getting ahead. And like I said before, ownership is really one of the key ways that people are able to build wealth. And then there's also the identity piece, which I find very fascinating, right? When you rent most of your stuff, how do you express who you are? How do you create a space that feels authentically yours? I think some people love the challenge of renting. They see it as freeing them from these material attachments and force them to define themselves in other ways. But I think for a lot of people that are renting everything, that feels destabilizing. When your environment is always temporary, if your belongings are always borrowed, what anchors your sense of self? There's also really interesting status psychology at play here. I think in previous generations, you signal status through ownerships, the house, the car, the quality furniture. But when ownership becomes unaffordable, this status signaling has to shift. So I think we're seeing a growth in status signaling through access over items. Instead of, like now anybody can rent the latest iPhone, rent a super nice apartment, even rent designer clothes. And so I think we're seeing a shift now where signaling status, signaling wealth is done through access instead of stuff. And I think this is particularly tricky because the psychological satisfaction of status signaling is real and immediate, while the long-term cost of never building equity feels abstract and distant. Our brains are wired to prioritize immediate gratification over long-term consequences, so the rental model plays right into those cognitive biases. What I think is a really important psychological dynamic at play, which is anxiety about the future. When people feel uncertain about their economic prospects, they often become more risk adverse, not less. And ownership can actually feel risky when you're not sure that you'll be able to afford the payments 15, 30 years down the road, or when you're worried about job security, or when you don't know where you'll be living in a few years. And I think renting feels safe for a lot of people because it's more flexible, more reversible. When your financial situation changes, you can always return the stuff and reduce your payments. With ownership, you're a lot more committed. You have to keep making payments or you deal with the hassle and financial loss of selling. And so I think a lot of people are choosing the safer option of renting, but they actually might be making their long-term financial situation less secure. They're avoiding short-term risks while taking on this long-term risk of not being able to build wealth. And because these long-term consequences are abstract and distant, they don't trigger anxiety the way immediate risks do. So I think a lot of people end up in this weird space where renting feels responsible and ownership feels risky, even though in a lot of cases the math is opposite. Okay, so I've talked about the economic forces driving this rent everything trend and the psychology that makes it appealing. But the question really is, who is getting rich off this rental economy? Whenever there is a massive shift in consumer behavior, there is usually someone positioning themselves to capture the financial upside. In this case, it's not the people doing the renting. I want to talk about the basic business model of renting, because it's very smart from a profit perspective, right? So instead of selling somebody a $1,200 couch once and never seeing you again or seeing you in 10 years, you can rent somebody that couch indefinitely. Do the math, right? Like if you rent that couch for just 20 months, you'll make your money back. Everything after that is pure profit. And just because the couch doesn't disappear for 20 months, it keeps working. It keeps being usable. You could potentially rent it to someone else in the future. And from a business perspective, this is about maximizing lifetime consumer value. Instead of one transaction, they create an ongoing relationship. Instead of one payment, they create a recurring revenue stream. And that explains why we see so many companies adopt a rental model, adopt a subscription model, or make it very difficult to repair or replace your items so you're constantly having to buy more from them. These companies have learned to design their services to keep you renting indefinitely. They make it super easy to add new items, but a little bit more complicated to return items that you won't bother doing unless you're very motivated. And again, it's this psychology applied to physical goods. And just like a subscription service like Netflix or Spotify, the goal is to make the monthly payment feel so small and automatic that you stop thinking about it as a choice you're making each month. It's also really important to point out that every rental company is also a data company. They know what you like, when you like it, how long you keep it, when you return and why. They know your size, your style preferences, your price sensitivity, your decision-making patterns. This data is incredibly valuable, both for optimizing their own operations and for selling to other companies. They can predict fashion trends before they happen. They can identify which products are more profitable to stock. They can even sell insights about consumer behavior to manufacturers and retailers. So you're not just paying them monthly fees, you are actually paying them with valuable data that they can monetize. You are essentially paying to be their market research subject. But the most insidious part of this business model is how it's designed to prevent you from ever transitioning back to ownership. A lot of these monthly payments are designed and deliberately set to feel kind of like affordable enough and kind of to prevent you from being able to save up to outright buy that thing in the future, And it's kind of like being stuck in a debt cycle, except instead of owing money, you owe continued access to your furniture, clothes, whatever. You become financially dependent on that rental company to maintain your current lifestyle because lifestyle inflation is a very real thing. Once you start spending to a certain amount, you get used to that spending and it's very hard to cut back. Companies know this. So once you kind of own that thing, it's hard to part ways with it and companies kind of take advantage of it. And this dependency is profitable for these companies in ways that go beyond the monthly fees. Once you kind of locked into their ecosystem, they can raise prices, add fees, change terms, reduce quality. And again, because they know that switching away requires a massive upfront investment that a lot of people either won't notice or just won't make. And I want to talk about how all of this together is part of a larger, massive transfer of wealth from individual consumers to corporate shareholders. When previous generations bought cars, furniture, houses, they were building personal equity. When they paid off those purchases, they own those assets. Maybe they retained some value that they could either sell, get some money back, or pass on to their children, right? The money spent was ultimately either an investment or just equity that they could get back. But when you rent everything, all that money goes to building someone else's wealth. A lot of the monthly payments that you make is profit for the rental company, many of which are publicly traded. A lot of times it does not contribute to your net worth. It contributes to other people's. And over time, this difference is enormous. Let's say you spend $300 a month renting various items, clothes, furniture, electronics, whatever. Over 30 years, that is over $100,000. If you had spent the same money buying things that even retained half their value, you would have $55,000 in assets. So to get crystal clear, who is benefiting from all this? A lot of times it is the investors, the venture capitalists, the private equity firms that are funding these companies. A lot of these businesses are either publicly traded or venture backed, which means that they are designed to scale rapidly and either go public or get acquired for massive profits. So the end game isn't just to rent you furniture, it is to create a new asset class where ownership of everyday goods is concentrated in the hands of a few large companies while individuals are perpetual renters and relying on these companies. It is basically applying the renting housing model to everything else in your life. And just like renting housing, this creates a two-class system, the people who own the assets and collect the rents, and the people who pay the rents and don't build wealth. And the really concerning part is this is not happening by accident. It is a very deliberate business strategy designed to extract maximum value from consumers while giving them minimum equity in return. I want to get into the nitty-gritty of why our individual brains are so susceptible to this rental economy, even when the math doesn't work in our favor. The biggest psychological factor driving rental decisions is what is called present bias, which is our tendency to weight immediate costs and benefits over future ones. So again, let's go back to that couch. When you're looking at renting versus buying a couch, your brain is focusing on that immediate comparison, paying $60 now versus $1,200 now. That $60 obviously feels better because it's less painful right now. Your brain doesn't naturally calculate 60 per month for 2 years, etc. Because, or even that after those 2 years, you might not have anything to show for it. You have to give the couch back. This is the same psychological bias that makes credit card debt so appealing and retirement savings so difficult. We are wired to prioritize avoiding immediate pain over maximizing long-term gain. And the rental economy has essentially weaponized this cognitive bias. They have figured out how to make their offerings feel cheaper by spreading the cost out over time, even when the total cost is higher. And we see this a lot too with like buy now, pay later, and just other types of short-term financing and debt. There's another cognitive bias at play here called mental accounting, which is the way we categorize different types of money and spending in our mind. So if you think about buying a couch, that feels like a big monthly purchase that you have to save up for. But when it's broken down into these little payments, it feels more at just like kind of this little monthly expense every month instead of, no, this is going to this large purchase. Because it's broken into these small things, our brains look at it differently. And this is also dangerous because monthly expenses tend to be sticky. And this psychological trick is everywhere in the rental economy. Car subscriptions, furniture rentals, clothing services, they all lead with that monthly payment. And then you have to kind of do the math yourself to figure out the total cost. And again, like I said before, once you start paying that monthly amount, that becomes your baseline. Your brain adapts to the payment and stops perceiving it as expensive. I think another major psychological factor here is loss aversion, which is our tendency to feel the pain of losing something more strongly than the pleasure of gaining something equivalent. When people consider buying furniture or a car, their brains immediately start imagining all the ways it could go wrong. What if you hate it after a few months? What if it breaks down? What if you want to move? What if your taste changes? The potential for regret feels overwhelming. Renting feels like it eliminates these risks. If you don't like it, you can return it. If market breaks, not your problem. If you want something different, you can swap it out. But this focus on avoiding potential losses makes us blind to the guaranteed loss of never building equity. When we're so worried about the possibility of making a bad purchase that we guarantee ourselves the outcome of never owning anything. There's also a very strong social psychology component to the rental economy, along with social media, rampant consumerism, and just people posting online and kind of the social contagion of everybody owning everything. We are social creatures and we unconsciously model behavior on what we see others doing. So if everybody around you is owning the latest thing or just embracing the rental lifestyle, it feels normal. But sometimes the herd is being manipulated by marketing and social media campaigns that are designed to normalize these behaviors that benefit companies rather than individuals. And the rental companies spend millions on influencer marketing, social media campaigns that are specifically designed to create the social proof. They want renting not just to feel normal, but aspirational. And so much of this is built around comparison culture. The rental economy promises access to things that you might not be able to afford outright. Designer clothes, luxury furniture, the latest electronics. Your brain gets excited about the possibility of having all these things, even if it's renting, right? This is called hedonic adaptation, which is our tendency to quickly get used to any improvement in our circumstances and then want more. In our economy right now, there is so much uncertainty. I think a lot of people feel like the American dream is dead. Like it is harder than ever to get ahead, to build wealth over the long term. And there's many responses that people, especially young people, have to this. But I think a big one is financial nihilism, right? Like if you believe that you're never going to be able to afford a home, you stop trying to save for one. You try to live in the moment. And again, if you believe that ownership is just for rich people, you don't develop the financial habits that could potentially build wealth over time. A lot of this informs and is driven by financial anxiety. And I think so many people right now are financially anxious. And, a lot of people use spending and use purchasing as a way to satiate themselves or feel less financially anxious. And renting gives you the ability to own something or to have something immediately, which can kind of be a self-soothing thing. I think really the rental economy in a lot of ways enables this financial avoidance that people have. It allows people to have a certain lifestyle without ever having to engage with these more challenging aspects of building wealth long term. You might be wondering, what does this actually mean for your personal financial future? How do you navigate this landscape? I want to start with the reality. Wealth is built through owning assets that appreciate in value over time. This has been true for centuries and it's still true today, despite all the marketing about ownership. When you rent everything, you're essentially choosing to be a perpetual consumer rather than an investor. Every monthly payment you make is an operating expense that disappears forever. None of it contributes to your net worth. And I know that $30, $40, $50 a month might not feel like a lot of money, but that's an example of how these small financial decisions can compound into big wealth differences over time. And these implications go beyond the stuff you're renting. The rental economy mindset can interfere with wealth building habits that you need for retirement security. If you're comfortable never building equity in your furniture or your car, it's easier to rationalize never building equity in your investments either. If you're used to thinking of all your monthly payments as just expenses, it's harder to prioritize saving and investing. And if these current trends continue, we are looking at a generation that will reach retirement age with no accumulated assets from a lifetime of monthly payments. No house they own, no cars they own, maybe not even furniture they own. And I think that could accelerate the retirement crisis by normalizing a consumption-based lifestyle that does not transition to wealth building. And I'm not saying that you should never own anything. There are absolutely situations where renting makes financial and psychological sense. But the key is to be strategic about when to rent and when to own. So here's my framework for thinking about renting versus owning. I would consider renting when you need something temporarily, like less than 2 years, or you're genuinely uncertain about your preferences and you want to try before you buy, or the price of the item depreciates rapidly and you just know that you will want the latest version of that item. You're not willing to keep it for many years, or you move frequently, or you just can't afford to buy quality and would otherwise buy something that would need frequent replacement. That would be really low quality. That's what I would think about when I'm considering renting. This is when I would consider owning. This is the framework, is when you know you will use that item for more than 2-3 years. When that item holds value and could appreciate over time, or when you can afford to buy quality that will last, or when the total cost of ownership is less than the total cost of renting. I mean, total cost. One big strategy that I always recommend when thinking about owning versus renting is the 80-20 approach, which is own the 20% of stuff that accounts for 80% of your daily use and long-term value, and then rent the rest if you want to rent. I think for most people, that means owning basics like a car, furniture, a good mattress, quality electronics. These are items where ownership typically makes financial sense and where having consistency and control matters the most. Then maybe you want to rent the rest, like the seasonal items, the trendy pieces, the things you're just not sure about owning. That gives you kind of the flexibility benefits of renting without giving up the wealth building benefits of owning. And again, I think really there's no right and wrong. It's about finding that middle ground, that hybrid model that balances your psychological needs with your reality. So if you genuinely value flexibility and variety over accumulating stuff, That's a valid choice. But make sure that you're channeling money that you save into other wealth building activities, right? If renting furniture saves you $200 a month compared to buying, invest that $200 monthly, right? If you love having access to designer clothes or rental services, that's fine. But maybe buy your basic wardrobe and only rent special occasion pieces. The key is really about being intentional about your choices rather than just defaulting to what feels easier in the moment. Ultimately, the rental economy is really just one piece of a larger financial picture. Like the same biases that make renting appealing, like present bias, loss aversion, that can undermine wealth building in other areas. And the real skill here is learning to recognize when these biases are serving you and when they're working against your long term interests. Sometimes avoiding commitment makes sense. Sometimes embracing it can build you that security and wealth. The rental economy is not going to go away and it's probably going to keep growing, but that doesn't mean you have to let it kind of hijack your financial future. I think it's important to know that you can engage with it strategically on your own terms in ways that support it rather than undermine your financial goals. Thanks for sticking with me through this deep dive. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more money psychology content. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next week.